Hello and welcome to Indian Standard Time. I'm Siddharth Varadarajan and our focus for today's show is going to be on Africa and in specific women in Africa. I'm joined today by Thokozile Ruzvidzo, head of the Gender and Social Development section or division of the UN Economic Commission for Africa, and somebody who has a great deal of experience looking at and working on the problems of women in the continent. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thokozile, 2016 is the year that the African Union decided to focus on specifically the rights of women. So it's the year of human rights with special focus on women. And in a lot of the literature that I reviewed, preparatory documents for the UN, for the AU summit, the overriding challenges that leapt out in terms of problems that women confront were broadly classified into 6 or 7 areas. And for the benefit of our viewers, I'd like to use your expertise to discuss what these challenges are and what kind of progress Africa and African women have made in addressing these challenges, and also what India can learn from the African experience. There are plenty of positive examples that the African countries probably have for India, and likewise there may be things that India is doing which may be of use for Africa. And if we could start with challenge number 1, which has been discussed very widely, which is the problem of the relative lack of political participation or the presence of women in public and political life. We have high-profile examples, obviously. President Sirleaf Johnson of Liberia, Amina Mohammed, who's the foreign minister of Kenya, and of course, Madam Dlamini Zuma of the African Union Commission. High-profile, very successful African women. But how would you rate the performance of Africa in terms of the presence of women in public and political life across the continent? I'm talking politics, I'm talking the economy, I'm talking leadership positions in different sectors. How would you characterize the progress that Africa has made?
Thank you very much for having me. And it's interesting that this is my first visit to India. Not to say that I don't work and relate to a lot of Indian people, especially Indian women. For example, I meet with the Indian women at the Committee on the Status of Women, which happens every year in March in New York. But in response to your question, which is very interesting, I want to situate the theme of this year's African Union Summit generally to the themes of the African Union Summits. Last year, the theme was on women's empowerment. And it's interesting that this year the theme is on focusing on human rights with special emphasis on women's rights, because there is a linkage in moving from women's total empowerment to looking at specifically their rights. And it was a deliberate decision by the African heads of states to focus on women for these 2 years. Next year the theme is on youth and work, which is also an interesting theme because you would still want to look at where is the situation of young women. Having said that, what is important for me, before I specifically come to the challenge that you referred to, is the political will. For me, the 2 years that have had the themes on women shows a political will in the continent by the African heads of states. And the chairperson of the African Union, who you've just mentioned as, as one of the examples or that we can share about women being in decision-making in political institutions, deliberately decided that there is no point in having a theme on women and we don't hold heads of states accountable for their commitments. They make commitments. I was just sharing at the conference I'm attending that the India-Africa Summit, and I'm sure they come and make commitments on various development issues, including women's empowerment. But those commitments have to be accounted for. There has to be accountability. And as a result, the chairperson of the African Union Commission, Madame Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma, decided that every year there should be a scorecard. A scorecard that measures the performance of heads of states on those commitments that they've had. And the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, where, as you rightly said, I had the African Center for Gender, was requested to develop that scorecard and look at the indicators that we measure heads of states' performance on. And one of the indicators last year was obviously on women's participation in political and decision-making positions. And I'm particularly mentioning this because when I look at all the indicators that we are going to talk to, I'll also be referring to this scorecard. And using that scorecard, heads of states are given awards.
So what's the metric for public and political participation? Is it number of MPs or?
So it's number of MPs. So we look at parity. Okay. Basically, when we looked at women in decision and political positions in the awards last year, when we looked at the political positions, we looked at parity. Is there parity? Are you achieving parity? And this year, and the summit is going to be in a few days' time, starting over the weekend. And on the women's rights, we're basically looking at how we are scoring. We're giving scores on 0, 1, 2, and heads of states are given awards. Using that to look at the performance and also the just ended Beijing Plus 20 review that we did last year, Africa is doing well, not very well, not poorly. There are countries that are excelling. Rwanda, for example, is above parity, women in parliament and decision making. There are countries where, for example, in SADC made a decision that in their own region, every decision-making position, there must be parity in government, in cabinet, in electoral.
These are for the benefit of our viewers, the Southern African countries.
These are the Southern African countries, and they hold their ministers accountable to that, which means they have to have a parity of 50-50. Obviously, that's parity, and SADC is doing fairly well. West Africa, yes, is doing well, but there are some countries that are not doing well. So there is progress, but much more could be done. And that could be done both at the ballot box, as well as parties having affirmative action. In countries like Uganda, where there is both affirmative action as well as constituencies that are meant for women only, which means in those constituencies, there is no competition between men and women. It's only women who will stand.
So all voters, men and women, vote for
female candidates
okay.
only in selected constituencies. And
when was this introduced? Because in India, this proposal to have 1/3 reservation of seats, affirmative action of seats in parliament for women, was proposed more than 10 years ago. But they simply can't pass it because of vested interests, as you can imagine. When did Uganda do this?
Uganda, I think they've had 3 elections where they've had the affirmative action.
Right.
And what is different about the affirmative action is there are constituencies where, as I've said, men don't stand, it's women only.
Right.
But on all the other constituencies, men and women compete. Right. So you have special constituencies, then you have mixed constituencies, and obviously, affirmative action, you find it in quite a number of countries, not the Uganda way, but you find them in a number of countries in Africa. Resistance shows at the ballot box, where you then find that women are not voted in. One, culture. We all know, and I think this applies to India. I've read so much about India, how our culture segregates women. It's how we are brought up. Men are more superior than women. It doesn't apply to the Indian communities only. It's the same in Africa, and it's difficult to change that mindset. And it's not a mindset that is in men only. It's also in women, where we think leaders are men and not women. So you have to think about that mindset. You also have to think about us women as well, not willing to be candidates for political positions, because it's seen as, either your husband will not allow you to stand, or it's seen as, are you a woman of good standing who wants to go and stand in public and speak? Also, you need resources. And in most instances, women are not, well endowed in terms of finances to be able to stand in elections. Then the other critical point is we are not really politically astute to be able to maneuver our way. And in most instances, elections are a difficult situation where there is some corruption, where you have to buy votes, and women tend to shy away from those situations. So that's why we are probably not doing as well.
Especially in countries where the democratic system is not as democratic as it ought to be, perhaps.
For sure.
Right, right.
And quite a lot of countries in Africa are not as democratic as we would want to.
So if the SADC region and Uganda, and you said Rwanda, right?
Rwanda is the best, I think, in the world.
Who are the worst performers in Africa in terms of gender parity in the political in political and public life? Or do you want to say regions if you don't want to name countries?
I would want to not exactly mention countries, but we have a few countries in West Africa, 1 or 2 countries in North Africa, Central Africa that are not doing so well. In critical where religion is very strong.
So if I turn to the next set of challenges that that women have been discussing and that will be the focus in the summit from a gender perspective, is the problem of economic exclusion and also financial systems that in some ways perpetuate discrimination. So maybe difficulty in accessing credit. We do read of some inspiring stories, innovative uses of credit, financial disintermediation. India, for example, learned from the experience in Kenya of using mobile telephony to make micropayments, the whole M-Pesa business. So how much progress has happened in the last decade or so in the economic field as far as gender parity is concerned?
The Kenya example has been very inspiring for the rest of the continent as well. And now quite a lot of countries, not quite a lot, a number of countries are actually using the mobile phone for communities and especially women to be able to access credit, not only to access banking institutions, let me not say credit, but banking institutions, and beyond that to access information. But financing for women in business in Africa is a huge challenge. 1, women don't have collateral. 2, in some countries, and strangely enough, they still need their husbands, to vouch for them when they are opening an account or when they are applying for credit. I had a very interesting discussion with a small-scale miner in Ghana. She wanted to open an account to start a mining enterprise. And when she went to the bank in Accra, she was told that she needed her husband to come and vouch for her. And she decided not to open an account because she thought that was very undermining of her as a human being, not just as a woman. And interestingly enough, she's one of the big mining small-scale enterprises. I'm calling big small-scale because she's small-scale but big, and she's doing well mining gold. She decided not to go for that, for the loan, and basically use their own resources and their husband's resources. So where women are doing well, where they have access to credit, they actually do well. And studies, and I'm sure the same applies to India, shows that women are very good at paying back loans. But unfortunately, banks are not always willing in Africa to open up their doors to women because they don't have collateral. They are not sure whether the women are independent decision makers or they are dependent on their husbands. Also, generally, accessing finance in Africa is not always easy. And as a result, institutions like the African Development Bank are looking at different ways of financing women through equity banks, through the collateral coming from the bank itself, and the women accessing the bank, the credit facilities. And this tends to work well because women pay back.
For a variety of reasons, Africa has a larger percentage of women-headed households than many other regions. Are banks and governments mindful of the challenge that this poses when it comes to designing public policy, designing bank policies and so on?
I think more and more now we are starting to see that governments do recognize that, we have a lot of female-headed households, and policies are leaning towards supporting female-headed households, both in terms of, access to factors of production like land. More and more legislation. We are doing a review of legislation in Africa that allows women access to land, for example, access and control, because access doesn't necessarily mean control. Control means you have a title deed. And we see that more and more legislation is being put in place to allow women to have control through title deeds, through inheritance, where they can be, fair inheritance. It doesn't matter whether you are the elder child or as a woman. Now inheritance in a lot of countries through legislation. The practice is different though, because it's not everybody has access and knowledge of that legislation. And a lot of the work that civil society organizations are doing is to provide information and knowledge. And the phone itself is being used a lot now in Africa, because interestingly, it's one of the continents where even in the village, women do have telephones. So civil society is trying to pass on knowledge and information to women on the ground, what their rights are, what the law says in terms of inheritance, especially inheritance. So this is, these are some of the major developments in light of the challenges that do exist.
The next set of challenges that confront African women, again, is something very familiar to us in India, which is the lack of access to education, and in particular the poor retention rate of girls in schools, higher dropout rate for girls than boys. In India, we've tried a variety of methods. One of the initiatives taken recently was when studies showed that parents were reluctant to send girls to school because many schools lack toilet facilities. So there's been a focus on creating toilets. Midday meal schemes have been introduced to again encourage this. But what are some of the initiatives that have been taken in Africa that India could look at?
Do you know what is interesting in Africa is if you look at our MDG performance in education, Africa has done very well in terms of enrollment, as well as curbing school dropouts amongst girls especially. We are not doing so well in secondary school education, and definitely where that's where the challenges are. The girls have reached puberty. It becomes difficult to go to school, during certain times of the month, as we all know. And more what is happening in some of the countries is, introducing free sanitary towels for young girls going to school. Toilets, whilst they are a challenge, they are not a huge challenge, because a lot of the schools in Africa now, through programs with UNICEF, programs with UNDP, have been building toilets, and accompanied with that are scholarships for girls to secondary school. Usually primary school education is free, and I'm sure that applies to India as well, but secondary school is often not free. So a lot of scholarships are being offered. Government is coming in with special scholarships for girls to keep them in school, as well as incentives for parents who send their girls to school. That helped to keep up the figures at primary level, and the challenge now is doing the same at secondary school. We did fairly well with
the experiment of providing free sanitary towels. Is that something that's helping retention at the secondary level?
It is helping retention, and of course that's supported with the availability of toilets, because you'd obviously need those as well.
Right.
Indeed, it is helping, interestingly.
Right. Yeah, that will be some initiative that could be useful here.
And do you know, often, schools don't think of that.
Exactly.
In relation to girls, they hardly ever think about what happens to girls at that time of the month.
Right.
They'll stay away from school and eventually drop out because it's a stress.
Right. Gender-based violence is, again, it's familiar to women around the world, in Africa, in India too. Is there a measure that the UNECA has, your office has, to give us a sense of the trend of gender-based violence? Is the situation generally improving? Is it stagnant? Is it getting worse? Are there countries or regions that are better off than others?
I'm trying to think if I can give you a figure offhand, but not necessarily, but it's very high. And I want to call it violence against women. It's very, very high. In the UN, we tend to use violence against women, and I know generally people tend to prefer using gender-based violence,
right.
And it is high. What you have as official figures is not always the case, because victims don't report. They tend to shy away from reporting.
And we're talking about violence within the household as well as violence outside the home.
Both within the household, probably outside the home, not as high as within the home, because the figures within the home are often very secret. Families don't want to talk about it. Even in this conference, we're talking about how some women feel being beaten up by your husband shows that he loves you. So they will not go and report. And more, I know ministries of gender across the whole continent have been encouraging victims to report. They've been coming up with programs of support and legislation. The majority of the African countries have legislation in place where violence against women is seen as a crime. But as I've already said, people don't report, or if they report, they go and withdraw the cases against their husbands. The difference, though, I see in India, you have a much higher figure of violence against women in public rather than probably as well as in private. Our figures in private are not as high as in private. But of course, you have to think about countries that are in conflict,
right,
where figures are high. You have to look at girls and women who are abused in countries that are at war or in a war situation. Their figures are extremely high because women are used,
exactly,
you know, in
specifically targeted.
They are targeted in situations of war.
Exactly. And may I ask, the attitude of law enforcement and the police in India, for example, in situations, I mean, on paper the laws favor women. In practice, when women go to report crimes of sexual crimes in particular, they face unhelpful attitudes by law enforcement in many parts of the country. Is that also an experience in Africa, or are things better?
No, it is the same experience, and in quite a number of countries. And the countries where I come from, Zimbabwe, I know there's been a lot of, by government itself, they've been doing training for enforcement agencies for them to understand both sexual and violence against women, what it means and what their response should be. But it is the same as in India, where it's ignored. The law enforcement will probably give a deaf ear when a case is presented to them.
If they can help it, exactly. Yeah.
Or if they don't know how to handle it, and then they just leave it as it is. But a lot of work is being done to enlighten law enforcement agencies.
Right. Harmful cultural practices is another area of stress for women. It produces or in a sense makes their situation worse. What are some of the specific challenges that the African Union and UNECA and your office are looking at? What's the progress that's been made in the last decade or so?
You know, I'm sure you all know that Africa is 54 countries. And it's not all the 54 countries that have a challenge of female genital mutilation. It's actually common in 13 countries. And in those 13 countries, specifically us in the United Nations Economic Commission, in the African Center for Gender, we have a program with an NGO that is looking at those 13 countries and helping them to put legislation in place. We don't work at the country level, at really operational on the ground, but we work with governments in terms of legislation. But the particular NGO then helps the countries to look at how to translate the legislation into action through awareness raising, a lot of advocacy, trying to educate the women who are actually responsible for the either the stitching of the girls or the whole process, to make them understand it's still a challenge in some of those 13 countries. Some of them have passed legislation, some of them have not passed legislation.
So
the challenge is both to get the legislation and to get the legislation operationalized by the government.
So the attitude of governments is still a challenge, actually. I mean, confronting society is a different level of...
I think there is an acceptance that they have to do something.
Yeah.
But the action is always not as easy as the acceptance.
Right. But this is an acceptance, in a way, a response to international pressure rather than understanding how regressive this practice is.
Right. Like I said, you commit to certain agreements and declarations when you go to the United Nations, and you're expected to deliver when you come back to your country, and sometimes it doesn't happen.
The final challenge that I wanted to discuss, we don't have too much of time, but Africa is home to around 18 or 20 armed conflicts of one kind or the other, and the exclusion of, well, first of all, the impact of conflict on women we've discussed. It has a specific dimension, adds a specific viciousness to gender violence, or violence against women, as you said. But the exclusion of women from peace talks, the peace table, has also been identified as a problem. Whenever negotiations are mooted, women don't find a voice. Is that something which, through your good offices or the African Union Commission, headway can be made and is being made?
I think what the current chairperson of the African Union Commission did as soon as she took up her position was to appoint a special envoy on peace and security. And this was a woman who's been working with almost all the countries that are in conflict on peace and security. And her responsibility was basically to go down and help to get women being involved in peace and security negotiations. For women themselves to get the ability to negotiate, to have the skills of negotiation, so that there is no excuse not to involve them. Because otherwise governments that are negotiating will come back and say, we don't have the people, we don't have the women, we don't have the numbers. So she looked at how do you support and strengthen women to be able to have abilities to negotiate. Two, to push for them to be in peacekeeping, in peace and security negotiations. And there are some examples that we can share. The Burundi, not the current, the first breakout of 4 women were involved in peace negotiations. We've had the peace negotiations in Uganda with the North, and women have been involved. But this is an ongoing process and it will take a long time. Basically, whilst women are victims of wars, they are never seen as being the most important in negotiating peace. And yet we know women are peacemakers, and they could play a much more important role in negotiating peace.
On that note, we will have to leave it there. Thokozile Ruzvidzo, thank you so much for joining us. We've covered a lot of ground. I hope for our readers this has been a great introduction to the problems and challenges that African women face and the work that you and your colleagues are doing.
Thank you very much. I hope I'll get an opportunity to hear how Indian women themselves are also doing on a number of the issues that we discussed.
Problems are in many ways very similar, and what progress you make would be of enormous help here and vice versa.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for joining us. Well, that wraps up this episode of IST. Do join us again next week with another guest. Thank you for watching.